This is actually part of a larger project. Initially, and hopefully still, this will form part of an edited book, edited by Barbara Stallings. And the goal was to get a variety of regional scholars together to use similar measurements for labor rights, and have the coding done by people who actually are regional specialists. And then to put these all into a book so that we can actually make some comparative statements across regions. So I was given the responsibility of doing East Asia, which is actually much broader than my usual expertise. I'm really a Southeast Asianist, and I do my field work in Indonesia. So doing the research for this forced me to expand considerably the sort of country base of my research. In the book there will also be a chapter from Eastern Europe, another on Latin America, and hopefully one on the Middle East, but the author of that chapter died over the summer, so that's sort of, before she could finish it, which is really too bad because she was a great person, but also there's so little comparative work about labor rights in the Middle East, and so it would have been really great to have that chapter in the volume. So hopefully that will end up in print one day, but it's, as many of you who have been involved in edited book projects know, sometimes they move too slowly. So I've moved ahead and changed things up a little bit, and what I'm presenting today will be published later this year in the Journal of East Asian Studies. So I'm moving ahead on my own with it. The indices that I'm using were produced jointly with Katrina Burgess at Tufts University. So although I'm presenting them today, they are not just my own work. The coding of the data, that's all my own, but Katrina and I developed these together equally. Okay, so the main questions that I'm addressing in this work are several. The first is how recent economic and political developments have affected labor rights in Asia. The main dynamics that I'm looking at are, for example, democratization. Most of you know in the 80s and 90s there were several countries that underwent democratization in the region. And also sort of the race to the bottom dynamics. Is globalization, did the Asian financial crisis open the door to lowering labor standards or labor rights? I actually don't like to say standards, labor rights in Asia. Then the other question was, are there some countries that are doing better than others? Some have stronger labor rights than other countries. And what are some problem areas? So are there some areas where countries are not making much progress or are sort of stuck in a rut? And then trying to think, and this is the part that's that I'm still working on, is possible explanations for the patterns that I find. The main goal of this paper was primarily empirical, to develop these indices, to present the data, because there's actually not a lot out there on this. So that's the first step, and then later on I hope to I have some preliminary thoughts on possible explanations, but as you'll see, countries are kind of all over the place, so it's hard to come up with this sort of one nice little model of labor rights regimes in East Asia. But that also makes it more interesting because there's variation. Okay, so the scope of the study, I'm only including 12 countries. Obviously, there are more than 12 countries in East Asia. Burma kind of falls out of it because there are pretty much no labor rights there, so it gets 0 on everything, so you won't see Burma on the charts. And I've also excluded some of the really, like I didn't put East Timor in there, in part because it's such a new country, and the labor laws there, I think, I'm not even sure they've even passed a labor law yet. So I look at both collective and individual labor rights, and for those of you who aren't labor junkies, the difference is collective labor rights is they deal with things like collective bargaining, the right to form unions, the right to strike. And individual labor rights deal with labor contracts between individuals and employers. So they determine things like hiring and firing, labor, the hours that you work, the flexibility that the employer has to sort of mold the contract with the worker. And then I also do something that is a little bit unusual, and that is I separate out de jure and de facto rights. So I code the laws, and then Katrina and I tried to figure out a way to, because, well, you're like, well, it's just the law. That doesn't mean that, rights are as good as they should be according to the law. We need to actually look at what practice is on the ground. And so we tried to come up with some ways to sort of factor in some things that would allow us to estimate what the real state of labor rights is on the ground in these two areas. Okay, so the main empirical findings. On collective labor rights, let me separate these out by the legal part and then the on-the-ground part. So in the countries that have undergone democratization, if you actually look at their labor laws, after democratization, they improved their labor laws. So collective labor rights, at least on paper, did become stronger. The laws are still not great in a lot of these countries, but all of them made improvements. The countries that did not democratize made minimal, if any, improvements in their labor rights situation in terms of collective rights. When you look at de facto labor rights, though, the picture is a little more depressing, because although even in countries that have democratized, even the de facto situation is much better, workers didn't enjoy the full measure of improvement in the laws because enforcement has been so weak. So that's something that comes up across the board for both individual and collective labor rights, is that enforcement in most countries in the regions is very weak, which is not very surprising. Some other things that were actually, were a little more surprising, though. I looked at unionization rates and compared them to the level of collective labor rights, and there's no correlation. So just because a country has stronger laws doesn't mean it has stronger unionization. It also doesn't mean they have more collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is actually still quite rare in the region. And the right to strike is the most violated of the labor rights in the area, and very little improvement has been made in those countries, even in countries that have undergone democratization. Now, on individual labor rights, I think the findings are a little more surprising, because if you read a lot of the race to the bottom work, you would expect that all these countries would be competing with each other and lowering labor standards. And with individual labor rights, I'm referring also to, you guys have probably heard labor market flexibility. Well, this is the area of labor rights that deals with issues related to labor market flexibility. And so in a lot of the discourse you find in international labor rights circles is like, oh, there's a race to the bottom. Labor market flexibility is being pushed on these countries by the international financial institution. It's not actually what I found in these countries, with one exception, South Korea, which is the one that everybody mentions, but that's actually the exception rather than the rule. You actually see countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and even now China adopting laws that reduce labor market flexibility, or in other words, offer greater protections for individual labor rights. So now, of course, practice on the ground, you often find flexibilization through the back door of non-enforcement of the labor laws. But the actual laws are getting more protective of individual labor rights, not less. Another thing that was interesting for the individual labor rights, which I did not find for collective labor rights, is that democracies do better than non-democracies. So if you look at the laws in democracies, they have much greater protections for individual labor rights, but not necessarily so for collective labor rights, which I thought was kind of interesting. So let me show you some of the data. Now, I apologize that because there are so many countries, and I cut it a lot of different ways, and I should have actually probably broken this down into 2 sheets. Can all of you guys see it? Yeah? Mm-hmm. So this is mostly, it's actually all World Bank data. So what we did is we took World Bank data for the individual labor rights, and then we did our own for collective labor rights. So I coded laws for collective labor rights, but I used the World Bank data for the individual rights. And so the rigidity of employment is a World Bank measure, so is the cost of firing. The de jure employment protection is something that Katrina and I did to sort of combine those. So the World Bank doesn't actually have one single measure that combines cost of firing and the rigidity of employment. And that's what the de jure employment protection does. And I can tell you more about that formula if you're interested in it, but I didn't put it up because
it isn't just
it's not
weighting
just,
or something.
You can't, because the cost of firing is in weeks, so it's not a 0 to 100 scale, which the REI is. So if you just average them, you would get screwy results.
But I mean, you could just recalibrate it and
You could.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we did something that was fancier than that.
Teri, a higher score would mean more or less
Right.
rigid?
So a higher score, I mean, would mean that there is more rigidity. So, and just to sort of translate this into individual labor rights, a higher score on this would mean lower individual labor rights, right? Because keeping in mind, this is, do you guys know the doing business data that the World Bank puts together? That's what this is from. And the whole idea of the doing business data, doing business project is to inform, folks about the difficulty or ease of doing business. And this is considered to be, if a labor market is rigid, right, if it's hard to hire and fire people, that deters investment. That's their view of it. So for them, a high score is bad, right? But it also means, for the way that I'm framing it as individual and collective labor rights, it means that individual labor rights are better. Okay. Yeah, but it can be confusing though if you're not sort of fluent in this lingo, because it can get kind of jargony. Yeah, so a higher number when you get to the DJEP, the de jure employment protection, it does mean that there are stronger individual labor rights.
However you sliced it and diced it, did you roughly equally weight the two?
Yes, yeah. So once we sort of scaled the cost of firing into something that we felt we could, then we just did a straight average. Once we scaled it, yeah. Okay, so just, it's a lot of data up here, and there's a few patterns that I think are fairly striking. If you look at the actual doing business data, East Asia comes off as being really, really flexible. But that's because they've got all these tiny little island nations put in there. If you actually look at the big economies in the region, which is what I've done, there's some, not all of them are big, but they're either big countries or big economies.
I mean, their averages aren't weighted, is that what you're saying anyway?
No, no, and not even just not weighted. I mean, they've got, like Fiji in there, which has like a 0 on all of these measures. Hong Kong, they put in, I mean, there are a ton of Pacific Island nations that have incredibly flexible labor laws. So they really, so if you look at their East Asian Pacific figure, they've got a 19 for the regional average, and I have 29. So what I've got is a subset of their East Asia Pacific that takes out takes out Brunei, it takes out East Timor, it takes out the really tiny island nations. And nobody has North Korea in their data, so wonder why. Okay, so a couple things are striking. So if you look at just the rigidity of employment, and that includes things like hours and overtime and those sorts of things, and also some hiring and firing procedures, but it doesn't include the cost of firing. The regional average of 29 is quite a bit lower than the world average. But if you look at firing costs, there's 68 weeks in East Asia, which is way higher than the world average of 48. So if you just look at the rigidity of employment index, Asia looks like it's a lot more flexible than it is. And I know that at least in the debates that I see in Indonesia, when the employers and workers or unions are fighting about stuff, it's about severance pay because the costs are really, really high in Indonesia. So severance matters a lot in terms of sort of assessing the overall flexibility in the labor market. And so, once you take both of those measures into account, East Asia is pretty much the same as the world. It's a little bit higher, 49 versus 48. So they're very close, but it certainly narrows the difference between the world average and the regional average.
Can I just ask about the interpretation of the cost of firing? So
yeah.
That means that in Indonesia, it costs an employer 108 weeks of salary to fire someone on average?
It's not an average. They take they assume a certain number of years of service, and I'm trying to remember if it was 10 years of service, or I think they use 10 years of service.
It's for some particular hypothetical worker.
Yeah, of being fired for economic reasons, because some countries make differences between the cause of the firing. So if you're basically for being fired when you're not at fault, with a certain number of years of service, and it includes also the notice period that's required. So the severance plus the notice period.
And this is all formal sector, but But that's what.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
what
because
employers
they're-
care about.
Yeah, right.
They're the sort of employers the World Bank is
Yeah.
looking for.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I noticed you don't have Europe and the United States there.
No, I
It might be
didn't.
interesting for comparison.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're worked into the world average, and I mean, it's easy enough to get that data out of the World Bank. But if you look, I mean, so there are some interesting regional patterns. Africa's really high on everything, and so just sort of speculating from where the regional averages are. My guess is that Europe is probably pretty close to the world average, because Africa just does 42, 68, and they're really high. And they're much higher than other regions when you come down to the combined. They've got a 56, and the other highest one is 49 in Latin America, it's my little subset of East Asia. So, yeah, but off the top of my head, I don't recall exactly the figure that for Western Europe. Okay, I should also mention the Singapore effect, because Singapore has a 0 rigidity of employment and has only 4 weeks for their firing costs. So they are so much lower than the other countries in the region that there is a Singapore effect, I think, in pulling down. If you took Singapore out, the numbers would be even higher.
You lump, but Hong Kong, it's what, two systems, one country,
Right.
but you lump them together?
No, they have different regulations, I believe. Although some of you guys are China experts, you could probably, say.
See, but you haven't broken out Hong Kong.
Well, Hong Kong has separate data in doing business, so they treat Hong Kong separately from China.
But it's
Yeah.
pretty similar to Singapore, isn't it?
It is very flexible. Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, but it is very low on these figures. So including Hong Kong would have brought it down for sure. Okay, so the other thing that's interesting is that democracies do a lot better than non-democracies. So I've separated it by democracies, semi-democracies. Semi-democracies, it just means they have elections, but they're not free and fair. And then the authoritarian countries. And there's a notable difference. The semi-democracies actually do the worst by far. And the authoritarian countries do pretty well because they're communists. So
Now, that's just in East Asia. You don't want to
Yeah.
try that on Africa, do you? Or-
Well, I mean, you could, the
Well, you
data's
could,
there, but I
right,
haven't.
yes.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it breaks down. I mean, and I'm just saying this is what the patterns that I'm
Yeah.
seeing in East Asia. I would not make similar statements for the whole world. Yeah, so democracies in East Asia do better. And there are some exceptions, though, that are pretty interesting. Cambodia is much higher than the other semi-democracies, and Thailand is much worse than the other democracies when their scores are lower. Okay, so this is just the law. It doesn't really tell us how things are on the ground. And so Katrina and I developed another fancy schmancy thing to try and discount the law for weak enforcement. And basically what we did is we took the World Bank's governance indicator for rule of law and set up a formula so that countries are penalized. And the way the formula is set up is countries that have strong laws and weak enforcement are penalized more than countries that have weak laws and strong enforcement.
But you used a general level of the probity of enforcement and applied it to this, is that it?
Well, we took whatever the rule of law figure is for that country and plugged it into the formula, and so the way the formula works is it'll vary if you took the same rule of law figure and you had a country with strong laws versus weak laws, the penalty would be different. And the logic for that is that weak enforcement is more damaging in countries with strong laws than in countries with weak laws. So the way to think about it is, so for example, let me use a collective labor rights example. In Indonesia, where I do my research, enforcement wasn't good when Suharto was president. He was a dictator. The laws were worse, enforcement was bad. But because the laws were so bad anyway that they weren't enforced, didn't really make labor rights worse, So now, though, that the laws have been significantly improved, I mean, they're the best in Southeast Asia, second, in the region as a whole. That weak enforcement is having a much more toxic effect because workers can actually demand more rights, but they are not being enforced. So that's the logic. That when there is higher respect for labor rights in the law, but that they're weakly enforced, that should be discounted more than countries that have bad laws that don't enforce them. So, anyway. All right, so one thing that's pretty notable is the scores drop dramatically for most countries. There are some exceptions like Singapore, which is not that surprising. They started off with a low score. Strong rule of law in Singapore. So, you know, their score does not change. Like 1%. There were some fractions in there. That's why you get that little 1% there. So obviously, one thing that comes up too is that the rich countries, if you look at the income categories, the rich countries, their scores drop less because they have stronger rule of law, which makes sense. They can invest more in the sort of institutional features that lead to stronger rule of law. And the East Asia average is pretty close to the world average. I don't actually have that up there, but it's you know, even when you take into account the actual de facto situation, it doesn't significantly, they don't start to depart from the world average. They're right on it. So there's no big change in that, in terms of that. Okay, so we also found that there's really not that much difference between regime types in terms of the amount that their scores drop. So the percentage changes across regime categories is pretty similar. Okay, so just some trends that you can't really tell from the data because that's a snapshot at one point in time. As I mentioned in my opening comments, labor law reforms are really not moving in a more flexible direction. The exception is South Korea, where after the Asian financial crisis, part of the IMF adjustment plan for South Korea was to flexibilize their labor laws. Although I've looked at the documents, they never put any sort of strict conditionality on that. So it wasn't like the IMF was going to take back their, not extend them more loans if they didn't do it. But it's mentioned in the paperwork, but it's not, didn't have the same level of conditionality as a lot of the other things like corporate restructuring that were in their rescue plan. And there were other political forces going on in South Korea too. You had a highly mobilized labor movement, and you had strong employers associations who really did want to change the laws as well. But the laws became more protective in Indonesia soon after the fall of Suharto. And in Thailand, in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, they actually changed the Labor Protection Act to become more protective of individual rights. So they did things like raise severance payment, put more restrictions on fixed-term contracts. And in China recently, a new contract law has been passed that also offers more protection. Of course, a lot of activists on the ground are skeptical about whether those will actually come to fruition because of weak enforcement. But the law, the American Chamber of Commerce mounted a very vigorous effort to oppose this change in the contract law, and I think they might have managed to tweak some things on it, but the law still went through. For other countries, there have been no significant changes in terms of the laws on individual labor rights. And I already mentioned the influence of the international financial institutions. Yes, in South Korea, it wasn't the only factor pushing in that direction, but in the other countries, I've looked at the documents. Indonesia, Thailand, there was no demands that they flexibilize their labor laws in terms of their labor conditionality, and I've had arguments with my friends in unions in Indonesia because they're sure that changes in the labor laws are being designed by the IMF, and I tell them, well, the IMF would be really disappointed because the laws have become less flexible, not more flexible, but I never win that fight with my friends. Okay, so collective labor rights. So this is moving on to things like collective bargaining, the right to strike, and forming unions. And this is a scale 0 to 100. Higher means stronger collective labor rights. Once again, I've sorted the countries by regime type. I should also mention Thailand. I put in the democracy category with some trepidation because things are really in flux. But for most of the period that I was coding these laws, I'm less nervous about it. But I'm also, it's really hard to tell where things are going to go right now. And so I'm just kind of like guessing. I don't think it would really, Thailand kind of fits in kind of awkwardly anyway. It almost, has more in common with a lot of the semi-democracies in terms of where it fits into the array. Okay, so the democracies actually are not doing much better than the semi-democracies if you just look at the average, but they are doing better than the authoritarian countries. We have no world data for collective labor rights because there's not an organization out there like the World Bank that is providing some sort of uniform coding
Why doesn't the
that we can
ILO?
use. But they don't have an index like this that will code it. I mean, they have a reservoir of labor laws, and a guy there, Kusera, has come up with an index, but it's not up to date. He did the paper quite a ways ago.
And what, the Independent Federation of Trade Unions?
Yeah.
ICFTU,
Yeah.
but they don't
just don't do
this.
that.
Yeah. I mean, there are some scholars who have done some work that looks at collective labor rights, but the thing that we're doing that's a little different is we are really sticking to the ILO standards in our coding. So we are accepting we're not imposing. I mean, there's one data set that's actually quite interesting. I'm trying to remember the authors, but what they do is they're really trying to look at whether the labor laws are likely to empower unions versus employers. But there are some things that would actually empower unions that would violate international labor standards. So these things could move in different directions. So we decided, just to be consistent, that we wanted to make it about internationally set labor rights. And that means, and that ILO I've written about this has a pretty liberal understanding of what constitutes collective labor rights. So a lot of things like that would actually empower unions, they would argue violate international labor. They use standards.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so you can think about things that might, under some circumstances, like a closed shop, you can think that might, be something that could empower unions. Well, unless it's done in a particular way, the ILO says that violates labor right, because, they have this liberal understanding that it's an individual's right to choose to form to join a union, and they should be able to choose to join another union. I mean, they're very consistent in this. The one area where it's interesting that they deviate from that a little bit is on replacement workers. They actually are really strongly against being allowed to use replacement workers. And I think if you went, completely whole hog the liberal route, you'd be like, employers can hire, freely, if workers want to go on strike.
What about the legislation? I've forgotten its name before Congress now.
The EFCA, Employer Free
Card
Choice
check.
Act?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Would that would probably run into
No,
would be a
actually,
violation.
no, it wouldn't. Actually, current U.S. labor law violates a lot of international labor standards.
Yeah, it does, which is one of the reasons why
Yeah.
that nobody would buy off
Yeah.
on ILO standards for these.
Yeah,
free
and if you want to
trade
talk about
things.
the EFCA after this, I would love to talk about the EFCA. But because of I'm really having fun watching the way the media is playing it, and part of, and I really think the employers are going to win this one because they have sexier ads and sexier lingo, and they can frame it as being, secret ballot, and, Americans love their secret ballots, so, don't take that away from me. And people are convinced that's what's happening, and so anyway, I don't want to get too off track, but yeah.
I have a question about why Burma pops up here and wasn't on.
Yeah, I just put it-
Excuse that.
Yeah, I
They
just,
bring that section
yeah,
too far.
yeah, I agree with you. And it would bring it up probably, somewhere into the, 60s, yeah. Yeah, and I put Burma there just so people realize they have no labor rights. But you're right, it really does pull it down a lot. And Burma wasn't in the previous data because the World Bank doesn't even bother to collect anything on it. So, and I've actually tried to get their labor laws, and they're really old, and a lot of the stuff is not even regulated there. So it'd be really tricky to how do I code this when it's just not there? Okay, so no world data, though hopefully if this edited book project comes along, we'll at least have some good regional data. There's some interesting cases that kind of jump out, like Cambodia is the highest, right? It's 90. So what's up with Cambodia? The other is Thailand. It's kind of the slacker in its group, right? On everything.
Cambodia
Thailand,
was, the labor laws were negotiated with the
ILO.
with the ILO and with the AFL-CIO.
Yeah. So Cambodia is really a special case for how
Yeah.
their labor laws came about. Now, actually, in practice, you'll see when I bring up the next slide, they plummet because unionists are like murdered there and intimidated and harassed, but they've got really strong laws, which is exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. But Vietnam too. I mean, Vietnam is 77, which is, it really stands apart from China and Laos. Much stronger laws on the books. And that's actually one of the, when I'm talking to my friends who work on Vietnam, it's like, so why is Vietnam so much better than China? Not just on their laws, but, they're less brutal. Like, there have been these strike waves in Vietnam. And the government has not been that rough with these workers, if you compare to China, and has actually capitulated and given them a lot of the things that they wanted. So it's, and I personally don't know enough about Vietnam to
I
answer
think in
that
Vietnam
question.
there was more residual suspicion of foreign, maybe it's a Vietnam War legacy. And one remarkable, maybe this isn't so remarkable,
Yeah.
but I discovered that this was in the late 1990s. The minimum wage, there were multiple
Yeah.
minimum wages, but the minimum wage for foreign factories was about 4 times
Yeah.
that for locally owned domestic.
Right, yeah. Well, there's more and more research being done on Vietnam now, so hopefully in another year or so I'll have a chance to think
Vietnam
about
also
more
has
about
the
it.
advantage of watching the China example, and they always like to
Yeah.
do something slightly more moderate than China does.
Yeah.
They've had that lag of a decade.
Yeah, some of my friends have said things too, like, well, the Communist Party there still, they haven't written off communism to the same extent that the Chinese Communist Party has. They still kind of believe in themselves as a workers' state, and that you can't just go in and shoot up the working class when all they're asking for is an increase in their minimum wage. They're not, they weren't demanding the overthrow of the Communist Party. They're like, we want, this is just what some people who've been there on the ground, they're not experts, but they've noticed, it's a totally different field than in China for them.
Well, the Vietnamese Communist Party has historically had stronger links with communist parties anywhere except
Yeah.
China.
Right,
so
yeah.
historically with the old Comintern and then with Cuba as well, which
Yeah.
they continue to have probably the strongest party-to-party relationship.
Mhm.
So it'd be interesting to compare them historically
Yeah.
with, say, the old Poland, the old East Germany, or Cuba today.
Right.
Ho Chi Minh helped found the French Communist Party.
Yes. Okay, so here's what happens. Now this is really messy, and this is we used a more complicated matrix for figuring out the de facto situation because collective labor rights are more overtly political, I think, than the individual labor rights. They're all political, but here you're getting talking about workers assembling together and demanding stuff as a group, right? Which has a different political connotation than individual labor contracts. So what we did is we did work in some rule of law stuff. We did it a little differently than with the individual labor rights. But we looked at things like, were there any activists murdered? Has there been routine harassment, intimidation, and detention of activists? Not necessarily routine, but it's more than an isolated incident. Unfair labor practices, is there a de facto union monopoly? And violations of EPZs or export processing zones. And by that we mean, are the violations sort of more severe in EPZs than in other areas? So if there were violations in EPZs that were pretty much the same as violations in the other part of the economy, we didn't code that. It was just where they were worse or special, and especially bad there. And then we also took Freedom House political rights because the sort of general political environment does have an effect on the freedom with which unions can engage in activities. So we put that all in, and we came up with a change. So what I have here is the de jure score here, which is the law, and then here's how much it changes. So, and in the top line of each regime category, you can see the change in the score. So the scores for all countries went down, but for some, they went down much more than others. Cambodia and the Philippines really stand out as having the largest declines. And they have the largest declines because there have been really extreme labor rights violations on the ground there. Multiple murders of union leaders in Philippines.
Here you're looking collective labor rights rather
Yeah.
than individual.
Yes, yes.
And you should probably, I mean, if there are not, if they're weak collective labor
Mhm.
rights, then you'd expect fewer murders.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it depends, right? I mean, if you have a group of workers who are trying to organize and the state doesn't want them to organize, then it's a question too of whether it's sort of routinized state violence, which you're going to find much more in China, or whether it's a sort of fuzzy, we don't know who killed them. I mean, China, is like the police and the government, and they're wearing uniforms when they do it probably. But in the Philippines, there's still, it's like people disappear, they're riding their motorcycle and somebody shoots them, they're being assassinated, so it happens in different ways. So it is, I mean, if you look at the countries where you do have a lot of these assassinations. I mean, I hadn't really thought about trying to see where they're stronger. Indonesia, though, doesn't have the really extreme violations, and they're right behind Cambodia if you at least look at the laws. So, yeah, but that's something that I should think about more.
What do you mean, Teri, by de facto union monopoly?
It means more than just whether the law gives one. So in communist countries, usually the state just says this is the only union, so you have a de facto union monopoly, which is a union that is affiliated or linked to the Communist Party. Singapore, in fact, really has one union, but you're not going to find it in the law in the same way. What happens is the registrar uses his or her authority to sort of thwart union registrations and to also intimidate independent unions politically. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew has threatened to bash heads of union leaders, and there was one time a pilots union was the only independent union in Singapore threatened to go on strike, and his response is, "You guys better shape up, or I'm going to bash in some heads," basically, So you do have, in effect, it's just the NTUC in Singapore, because this pilot union, I believe, has been busted. So, yeah. So Singapore is an interesting case because it doesn't get as much flack as Malaysia, but it's almost as bad. But the unions don't seem to be, giving them as much trouble. I think in part because they're so small. And you'll see when I put up the data in a
You don't
minute.
think it has anything to do with per capita income?
Why they're not giving Singapore a hard time?
No, why? Just why it's stable. Or just in general.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for example, Committee of Freedom of Association reports, so international unions can put cases in, domestic unions can put cases in. No international union has filed a Freedom of Association case against Singapore with the ILO, even though there are more than sufficient grounds for doing it. But for Malaysia, they have.
And what's your interpretation of that?
It just hasn't been a priority for international unions. I haven't done extensive research on why there haven't been any, but the NTUC would not file it because they are under the control of the PAP, which is the ruling party. So it would have to be an international union that would file it. And they haven't. And I haven't, talked to the folks at the international unions that make those decisions. But it's striking. And also, none have been filed against Vietnam. And the laws clearly violate principles of freedom of association. But they haven't done it. Okay, so, they have to set priorities. They can't take everybody in all the time. So, okay, so for all countries, it's lowered, some more than others. Cambodia and the Philippines really fall a lot. South Korea doesn't fall as much, but it's still pretty significant. And part of the reason that they have some serious violations with obstruction of using this clause in their law about obstruction of business. any of you guys know anything about workers and labor unions in Korea, they're really militant. And when they go out on strike, they are, in mass numbers.
Ian used to have a colleague, a retired gentleman who actually wrote part of the Korean labor, Mike. Right?
Like Banyana.
Yeah.
So they're really well
He's
organized, yeah, and but they're and I think the folks who wrote this law knew that, and so they put in this obstruction of business clause that pretty much allows the cops to arrest striking workers, and at one point, during a 5-year period, I think more than 1,000 trade unionists have been arrested. So South Korea, you don't see. And actually, the murder was actually in one of these protests. A cop basically ran over a striker, and that's the questionable. It's like, well, that's that murder, or is like, yeah, I would call that murder. But anyway, so South Korea is pretty. It's
Polarized.
it's got strong rule of law, so its score is not going to drop as much as some of these others. But it's got a very the authorities deal very roughly with unions when they mobilize collectively, with workers when they mobilize collectively, and will throw them in jail in mass numbers. Sometimes if you look at photos of these strikes, there are more cops than strikers, and they're in full riot gear. But the decline of scores is actually less in democracies than the others. So even though the democracies don't exactly do great, their decline is not as significant as the other regime categories. So let me talk a little bit, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because I'm kind of almost out of time here.
I'm sorry, we've been so interested, we've been asking a lot of questions.
But I didn't want to put up because there's variation between countries. So these are just some of the common constraints. The most common one is really that certain categories of workers are just not allowed to unionize. So, for example, in Thailand, civil servants not allowed to form unions, and that's a common restriction. So. And then for some countries, it's just unclear. Like in Indonesia, it doesn't say that they can't. It says they can, but another law will regulate it, which they haven't passed. Administrative hurdles to registering unions. Most of these countries have a union registration system, which is very different than in the United States, where the state doesn't actually register unions. It just recognizes the authority to bargain for other workers. Most of these countries actually have a process where you register a union, and then you deal with bargaining after the fact of registration. The Philippines, of course, is very similar to the U.S. in how they do it, which is probably, an effect of, the U.S. influence on the Philippines. Restrictions on political activities. Some countries don't allow unions to be involved in politics. And then the legal monopoly issue, which we already talked about a little bit. Now here's some estimates of unionization rates, and I'm using a couple of different measures and a couple of different time points. But the take-home point here is that there's really no correlation between the strength of the legal right to form unions and the level of unionization. Some countries like China actually has the highest rate, and I'm not sure we would want to say that China has the strongest unions or and they don't even have the strongest laws in terms of union formation. But it's of course an artifact of the links to the Communist Party and having the state sector so highly organized in China. Taiwan is also high relatively, and that's just because self-employed workers were encouraged to join occupational unions so they could get health insurance. So that's also not giving you a really accurate indication of the strength of unions in Taiwan. Okay, so collective bargaining is actually, of the three main collective rights, it's the one that is actually the strongest on paper. But again, because some workers don't have the right to organize, they also don't have the right to bargain collectively. And then even some workers that can form unions, the strength of their right to bargain is somewhat compromised. In a lot of countries, certain things are taken off the table. You can bargain about some things, but not about other things. Malaysia and Singapore like to do that. And this is actually the U.S. system, 50% plus one in order to bargain. That's actually, according to the ILO, a violation of international labor standards. And there are some countries that have that principle that in order to bargain, you have to represent a majority of workers. And in some, like Laos, there's no legal right to bargain at all. So there is, in essence, nothing in the law that guarantees workers or gives them any procedures through which they can claim the right to bargain on behalf of a group of workers. Okay, in practice, like I said, comparatively good on paper, but pretty weak in practice. Almost all bargains in East Asia are enterprise-level bargains, so you don't see a lot of industry agreements. In Korea, there are some, but it's the exception rather than the rule. The quality of the collective bargains are pretty low, and the coverage is still limited. And I found some data. This is, again, it's hard to get good data on this, but just to give you some indication, in all of Cambodia, 5 agreements. They're all in the garment industry.
And are they all with foreigners?
That I don't know, but I would guess because it's, either that or they could be locally owned
I don't-
Cambodian firms that are doing subcontracting.
Right, I don't think they're with foreigners, but
They're
sell their
being
product
sold
to
their
us.
output to foreigners, yeah.
I think that second line, when I was editing this, I took out the country. I think that was Indonesia. About 1% of the workforce is estimated to be covered. South Korea is higher, 7.3%. Singapore is also relatively high with 12%. Taiwan, that 21% is of union members, so it's not of the working population. So even among union members, only 1 in 5 is covered by a collective bargain, which is pretty amazing. And Thailand is extremely low, less than 1%. And then these are I think the data is stronger for like Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. For Indonesia, Thailand, people are taking a shot in the dark. It's just there's not any centralized means of collecting this data, so people are like, must be about that. On the right to strike, this is the one that has the most serious problems. All the countries have pretty serious administrative hurdles to striking. They require strike votes, and again, all these things are according to the ILO, are against international labor standards. So the law will actually say you have to have a vote if you want to go on strike. It's not left up to the unions themselves to decide what they have to do internally. The state is telling them you must have a strike vote if you want to go on strike. The ILO thinks that's a hurdle. Some countries allow one party or the state to refer a dispute to binding arbitration, which essentially gets rid of your right to strike because somebody can impose a settlement on you. Lengthy conciliation procedures that are required. So before you can go on strike, you have to sit down at the table with the employer and talk this many times over this long of a period of time before you can go on strike. Or a long notification period. So I want to go on strike. Well, you have to give me 30 days notice. And then, of course, a lot of workers don't have the right to strike at all. And this is sort of some workers, like public sector workers, they might have the right to organize, but then they're denied the right to strike. Okay, but strikes happen all the time in East Asia. So it's not just because it's so hard to strike, doesn't mean that workers aren't striking, but it varies across countries. But most of these strikes are illegal strikes because it's so hard to strike legally. Strikes are relatively rare in Malaysia and Taiwan, though. Singapore, no strikes for over 20 years. But, in the countries, especially in South Korea, Cambodia, less so in Indonesia, definitely China, definitely the Philippines. Workers are, who do go on strike, they do face threats, intimidation, arrest, and almost always dismissal. Okay, so one thing that we wanted to look at in our study was to see if there was some sort of relationship between individual rights and collective rights. So the de jure employment protection is the individual rights component, and the de jure collective rights, of course, is a collective rights component. And this is according to the law, and it does, take out Singapore, which is the outlier. There does appear to be a positive relationship between the two. Now then we did it the same thing, but for de facto. And the other thing too is, you see they're kind of in the upper half, right? Which I guess is good, right? But things get a little worse once you start looking at the de facto situation. The actual sort of relationship holds, and the slope of the line is pretty close. But most of them move into the lower 2 quadrants, with the exceptions of Indonesia and Taiwan.
Employment protection, you mean the same thing as rigidity?
Yes, yeah. Okay, so, and this is Thailand and Vietnam. I still haven't figured out a way to make PowerPoint stop doing the overlapping and the editors at the journal had to sort that out with some fancy software for me. I couldn't figure out how to do it. Okay, so, and the same, you have certain countries that are clustering together, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So Indonesia, South Korea, and Taiwan are often very close together. And I think there are some historical reasons for why they are clustering together. Okay, so let me get to the conclusion very quickly. Race to the bottom, at least if you look at the laws, no indication that countries are really making their laws weaker in order to try and lure investors into their markets. However, if you look at the de facto situation, I think you could possibly make a case that there is, because as you can see, the situation is dramatically different when you look at the actual situation on the ground. The problem is we don't have time series data to see if actually the de facto rights, to see if they're actually worse now than they were 5 years ago. And this is one thing that's going to really be difficult for us, because it's really hard to get historical data that will allow us to adjust the figures well. I think we could go back 5 years, but that's about it. Going back 20 years, there weren't these governance indicators. Coverage of these countries was not so good. So, I don't. We're going to have to figure out some other way to do it if we want to have de facto time series data. Okay, but I do think that the improvements in collective labor rights in democracies is real. So although it's not like a yay story because enforcement is so weak, I think very few people would say in South Korea or Indonesia that labor rights are worse now than they were under dictatorships. For all the problems that they're facing, the collective labor rights situation, at least, not individual labor rights, but the collective labor rights situation is better in the countries that, with the possible, well, things weren't great under Marcos in the Philippines, but Philippines is a really tough case because of all of the assassinations of leftists and union leaders that have been going on. On enforcement, like I said before, I think the effect is more toxic now because the laws are stronger. That improving, and one thing that I talk about with my union friends in Indonesia is like, well, is it better to invest your resources into trying to strengthen enforcement or to get stronger laws? And I actually pretty much concluded that I think they would, if they've already got pretty strong laws, don't obsess over the laws. Start putting your political action into getting stronger enforcement, because I think that would actually result in more real improvements on the ground than trying to change one little article in a law that you don't like, because you might change it and then it wouldn't be enforced and then you've got nothing. At least if you can start to work on a stronger enforcement system, you can keep some of those real gains, and especially in countries that have relatively strong labor laws like Indonesia. To me, that's a no-brainer. The other thing, too, is I think that if you look at the historical legacies, and in other research I've talked about what I call the legacy of protective repression. And by protective repression, I just mean that in a lot of authoritarian countries in Asia, they had a system where collective labor rights were repressed, but their individual labor rights were actually pretty protective. So in terms of labor contracts, workers had a lot of guarantees. It was hard for employers to fire workers, at least according to the laws. So South Korea falls into that category, Indonesia as well, and I think I would also probably put Taiwan into that category, and to a lesser extent the Philippines, but I think you could make a case
and
that...
doesn't this, I think that's a very important observation, but what it does is to highlight that whereas we tend to think of unions as being economic actors, the reasons for this repression were the fears that the unions would become base of political resistance.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So the idea that that Indonesia was suppressing the minimum wage in order to attract missed the point that Suharto was afraid that independent political unions would. And if anything, I think at least towards the end, Suharto started sending in the army to enforce minimum wage payments to...
because there was a strike wave in the early 90s, and so there actually was stronger enforcement, at least of minimum wage legislation, because that was almost always the demand of these strikes is to pay the minimum wage. That and for employers to pay menstruation leave. In Indonesia, there's menstruation leave for 2 days that women can claim every month, and women were, there were thousands of women working in these shoe factories and these garment factories, and in addition to demanding their minimum wage increases, they were also saying, pay us our BAGNAB, menstruation leave, and don't make us undergo humiliating inspections in order to get it. It's like, sure, we'll give it to you, but prove to me that you're menstruating. Like, who's going to do that? So anyway, so this legacy of protective repression. So then, this changes though with democratization, right? Because the individual protections didn't violate international labor standards according to the ILO, right? But all their collective labor laws were an extreme violation of these international labor standards that were recognized by the ILO. And you have a political opening or organizing, and so these repressive aspects of the laws were they weren't completely rolled back, but they were significantly changed and improved to strengthen labor rights. But this individual rights component kind of stuck. So one reason that you find Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and South Korea hanging together is because they have this legacy of protective repression. So I think this democracy thing can kind of be an artifact. That's not really what's driving it. It's this legacy of protective repression that is really the underlying cause. And that's why Thailand is so different, because it doesn't have, that sort of protective repressive regime. It has a very liberal sort of set of labor laws on both the individual and the, less so in the collective dimension, but its labor laws were set in the 1970s, and they were very, very different than what you saw in place in these other countries. So I actually think that, I was grouping them by regime type because that's just a nice way to organize it, but I really don't think on collective labor rights or even individual labor rights, it's really the regime type per se that's driving it, but it's really more the interaction of this legacy of protective repression with a regime change that opened up the political system. And then, as I said earlier, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand keep on coming up as countries that kind of deviate from the countries that I grouped them with. Cambodia, we already talked about. A lot of that has to do with the particularities of when they renegotiated their labor laws. Vietnam, we speculated a little bit about why Vietnam might be so different. And Thailand, I think it's, there's so little secondary work on Thailand on this that it's really hard to figure out, to do any serious research on it unless you speak Thai and can go in and talk to the folks who are, and I can't. But I think you have to go back to the 70s and look at, the dynamics of the formulation of those initial labor laws. And maybe someday somebody will do that. So anyway, so where I'm planning to take this next is just sort of start thinking a little bit more about some causal explanations for the patterns that I've been uncovering. And I think you can tell from my bent is to sort of take a more historical, perspective and trying to trace out how some of these initial labor laws were put into place, and then how changing political and economic dynamics sort of facilitate countries following certain paths rather than others. The protective repressive stuff I feel pretty confident about, but all these other cases that don't quite fit into that box, I'm still struggling with how I want to grapple with those ones. So
That's great, Teri. Thanks so much. Let's have some questions. Deborah?
Yeah, I was wondering why you were not weighting your de facto results by for example, the percentage of the labor force in formal employment. I mean, certainly that's a huge factor.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And actually how many people or what proportion of the labor force are affected.
Right, and that's one thing that Katrina, we actually at one point had worked that in, and the problem that we ran into is we were not able to find, and you know more about this than I do, we looked several years ago when we were putting this together for good comparative data that was using similar methodologies for measuring the size of the informal sector. And we were unable to find something to plug in. She actually had good data for Latin America, but I couldn't find it for Asia. And so, we wanted to do that, but we ran into a data roadblock. So I completely agree with you. And do you know of any places where to look that you might be able to find that? Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's some out there, but we looked and I looked and I know the ILO was working on something, but when we were doing this, there wasn't anything that made sense. That really.
I mean, certainly. I mean, you had the percentage of the in some cases, the percentage of the labor force in
Yeah.
agriculture was underlying
Right.
some of it. I think that would be a starting
Right.
point, because most of the agricultural labor force
Right.
is not in the
Mhm.
formal sector, so at least if you could get them out of the picture.
Yeah.
So among the, then you just have the non-agricultural
Yeah,
labor force.
and I
Because
see-
in some of those countries, it's a huge percentage in agriculture.
Don't you always have
Right.
data on primary, secondary, that sort of thing?
Well, that's what I'm.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And that should be available from censuses.
Right, yeah.
And actually, yeah.
I'm just trying to think, I mean, in Latin America, isn't a lot of the informal sector though actually urban too?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
Yes.
so it's like, it's really
Yeah.
hard. I mean, it's so important. I wish somebody would put together some nice little
Yeah.
data set for the size of the informal sector, because I think that, different measures will work better in different parts of the world, if we're trying to come up with an estimate. And, yeah, anyway.
And I was disappointed that there wasn't actually a labor-specific measure of enforcement
Yeah,
for the de facto.
it's hard, yeah.
I mean, can you look at things like how many inspectors?
That'd be
there
nice.
are? You can't even get that.
Well, I
information.
mean, let me tell you about my experience in Indonesia dealing with the inspection people. First of all, it's been decentralized, so every locality controls it themselves. But it's the most corrupt part of the labor bureaucracy there. And even going in, I said, so do you have any reports on what you've done in terms of inspections for the year? And, just so I can see, like, what, it gives you some indication. I was like, oh, no, we don't have any reports at all. And it's, because a lot of stuff is going on under the table. I'm sure they have some reports that they didn't want to show me them. And because you would be able to see how many employers they took to court, how many, cases they went past the 3 warning, and you would think most inspectors would have to do that to prove that they were working. So actually, of all, the whole labor bureaucracy, the inspector was the hardest to deal with. And I don't know if that's the same in other countries, but it's really hard to get good inspection data. Mark Anner is doing this in Latin America, and in order to get the data, he's actually had to go to every country and meet with labor ministry people. That, okay, like, how many inspectors do you have? And it's, you need
How many
to-
workplaces do they inspect?
Yeah. And I think this is a new area that
Yeah.
there's going to be more and more research, but it's sort of an area that's just started to take off in the last couple of years. Yeah. That's why, we had to make a lot of difficult decisions in this research, because there were all these things that we really wanted that we couldn't get our hands on. And it's always that way with research, right? And so you do the best that you can, realizing that it's highly imperfect.
Is there, Teri, we were talking earlier, just so briefly, about the fact the United States doesn't pay much attention to the ILO.
Right.
And quite a number of our labor laws would be in violation of
Yeah.
these so-called international
Yeah.
standards. But my goal in the question is not to be hostile, but just
Right.
probative. I mean, where does this stuff come from? I mean, are these just trade unionists talking with each other and
ILO?
spinning this out? Yeah, or what's the, how
It's a
does
long
orthodoxy?
story.
Yeah, no, I know it's a long story. I know it's a very long story.
The
And
short
I-
answer is it's
yeah.
tripartite, so it's not
Yeah.
just union. So it's,
Yeah.
somebody was trying to tell me, he's like, oh, well, the workers have the ILO. It's like, the ILO doesn't belong to workers. It's a tripartite organization.
Right. No, I
where
do know
governments,
that it.
employers,
yeah,
and unions
Right,
are all at the table.
but it seems, if you look at the data, it seems
Mm-hmm.
that it isn't a terribly vigorous part of the international system.
No, because they have no
No.
sanctioning power. All they can do is, kick somebody out of the ILO, and they don't even want to do that.
Mhm.
So, it's really, their power is either done, and they get it through other organizations who do have more sway, sort of hitching on, adopting some of their agenda,
Mhm.
or, just through shaming, if there, some way to mobilize some sort of transnational pressure. But the ILO doesn't actually do it. It can't really, it hasn't, I don't want to say it has no power, because
Yeah.
but not in the sense like it can't make a country do something. It can't make a country pay a high price. Like if you don't do this, we will punish you. They can't do that.
It's not like the WTO.
Right, yeah, right.
Well, there isn't much of anything.
And
like
the
WTO.
US hasn't signed on to all of the ILO's
Yeah.
conventions.
I beg your pardon?
The US has not signed
No,
on
I
to
know,
all
I know,
of the
I know.
ILO's conventions, so
Yeah.
it has not acknowledged the need to do
Right,
a number
right,
of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
right, right.
And one thing I actually took out of this presentation is looking at the ratification of core labor standard, ILO core labor standards. So they've set a bunch of labor standards as core. They have to do with like
Mhm.
child labor,
Mhm.
forced labor,
Mhm.
I think gender discrimination, and then freedom of association, right to organize, those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And Asia's was the worst of the regions.
Mhm.
I think, Latin America had almost all the countries had adopted all of the core labor standards. Eastern Europe, pretty similar story. And they were like, oh, we don't even need to put this in there because everybody is, all the countries are doing all of them. It's like, oh, not in Asia. Even the democracies. I think Indonesia and Cambodia and the Philippines are the only 3 countries in the region that have ratified all of the core conventions.
I mean, I read about this years ago, and I certainly am
Uh-huh.
not up to date on it, but I guess there's so many tensions. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the worker replacement. I mean, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
And, you tilt the prism just a slightly different way, and you get something that has a completely different kind of economic impact. So, did these standards evolve? Were they, have they really changed? I'm sort of curious because it does seem a kind of
Yeah.
outlier in the international system. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not a historian of the ILO, but I mean, you looked at conventions; they each have a number, so they do keep on adding, and each of them have to be, agreed to through in some official way and through these tripartite fora. And I think to add a new convention, it's probably got to be like everybody. It can't just be a subcommittee doing it. It's interesting if I don't know if any of you have ever looked at the digest of the Committee of Freedom of Association. That's where they actually talk about how they interpret the convention, so to put it in practice, and they've got all these little components to it, and they have actual segments of deliberations that they put in there, and so they are actively interpreting these conventions, and so their understanding of what they mean does evolve based on the kinds of cases that come before them.
It's case law. One thing that gets left out, because you've chosen to leave it out, because you're focusing on rights,
Right.
is substantive outcomes.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I guess that, for me, or
Yeah.
the where's the beef?
Right.
And many
Well,
of these
it's right
rights
here,
may.
right, which we didn't really talk about.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay.
Well, my answer is
Precisely.
no.
So the flexibility. Yeah. Your answer would be no.
Yeah, because it's not as flexible as people have been saying that it is. So it's not. I mean, think about South Korea. It was not getting ahead because it had flexible labor laws. It didn't have flexible labor laws.
Well, it had labor market flexibility. I mean, because you're talking in many cases about such a small part of the labor market, though, you really can't answer.
South
that question.
Korea is a larger part of the labor market than a lot of the other
Larger,
countries,
right.
though.
But a lot of work, at least earlier, by
Mhm.
Gary Fields and people like
Yeah.
that, suggested that where wage rates were effectively set by the
Right.
market, that was a predictor
Mhm.
of more rapid economic growth. And I don't know if your data have complicated the measures
Mhm.
of market, of at least, flexibilities.
Well, wages don't come into these measures at all,
No.
right? So. Yeah, I think the outcomes are important, and I do think that if you look at like the unionization rates, the collective bargaining outcomes, pretty depressing, and they do indicate that these improvements in labor laws have not produced significant improvements in outcomes, and so then you start wondering, well, why are they not doing that? And I can think of 2 explanations. One is it's because their laws aren't enforced, so if you enforce the laws better, you would have better outcomes. And these are mutually exclusive. And the other is that because a lot of these labor laws have been rewritten in ways, in some countries that actually encourage the fragmentation of of organizations rather than their consolidation, that you might have more unions, or in terms of the actual number of unions, but that doesn't mean you have more unionization. So in Indonesia, for example, when the labor laws were rewritten, 10 workers could form a union. You could have multiple unions in a single workplace, and so you had unions mushrooming up all over the place. But the payoff, it's not there. Well, would it have been better to have a situation like in Argentina, where you have industrial unions that are bargaining not at the enterprise level, but at the sectoral level, and having a real top-down sort of. And that, of course, violates all sorts of these liberal ideas about freedom of association that the ILO supports. I mean, the ILO is all over Argentina for violating international labor standards, but it's one of the only countries where the unions are holding on to some,
Market power.
yeah. So I think, there are probably a lot of different reasons for the situation, and then, I think the degradation of the individual labor rights is also part of it. I mean, how, if as in Indonesia, which is the case I know best, when I was doing my field work in the late 1990s, almost everybody was a permanent worker. Now they've almost all been put onto fixed term contracts, and so they're afraid if they join a union that their contract won't be renewed. So these things they interact in complicated ways that you can't get at with this sort of 12 countries. Yeah.
Mary, you've been
I have
awfully
a
quiet.
question. There was a little mention of the WTO. as
Oh, I'm
being-
sorry, we've run over. I see
Oh,
people
yeah.
starting to leave, but please, go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
I was just wondering, with the WTI, as you're thinking about in 2000, all the ruckus around China entering the WTO, and did they have to make improvements in labor rights to get that status, or did they done it after?
I'm sure that labor rights activists would have been jumping with joy if the WTO put any sorts of labor rights conditionality on a session. I mean, I've never heard of that happening. I'm pretty sure that it hasn't. I don't follow the WTO super closely, but that's one thing that labor rights activists have been demanding, that the WTO take into account labor rights, including looking at bad labor rights as being an obstacle to free trade, right, or an unfair trade advantage, as you could say. Haven't been able to get anywhere with doing that, and there are actually some workers' organizations in poor countries like in India who are against that. They think it's a protectionist measure. But there's debate within international labor circles.
Oh, I
about
think
whether that's a good
it's
idea.
it's much more than that. I mean,
Yeah.
most poor countries are adamantly
Yeah.
against at the
Yeah.
official level any labor standards at all.
Yeah, but I'm talking about
international
even
level.
unions
Yeah.
in some of these countries
Yes,
are.
and academics too.
Yeah.
I was reading some by
Yeah.
Neela Kabir. Do you know her at all?
The name sounds familiar.
Um,
Yeah.
A lot of them have argued that women's participation in the labor force is going to be hurt
Mhm.
if standards are too strict. I mean,
Mhm.
minimum wages are raised too high.
Right. Right.
Well, folks, this has been terrific.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Teri.
you.
And please come again. This